Bless the Lord, O my soul. This is a simple yet powerful phrase that repeats 5 times in this psalm that we're exploring today. It sets a tone, it evokes a theme, it calls the hearer to remember the saving grace of God. Psalm 103 is attributed to David, and there are some interesting style points of this psalm that give us a glimpse into another layer of message that David was trying to impart to us as the hearers. This poem was written with the same opening and closing lines, bookends, if you will, to the main message. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me, bless his holy name. Gives this clue from the very beginning that this was written to evoke praise and thanksgiving from the hearer. Hand in glove, these two elements, praise and thanksgiving, go together, and they stand as the basis for what is written. The bless was not given as a suggestion, it was given as an instruction. The focus of this call for blessing was not towards people to bless one another, but it was towards God and God alone. Bless the Lord, O my soul. This psalm, as we would see it if we could see it written in Hebrew, would contain 22 lines, which is the same number of letters in the Hebrew alphabet. This was a tool that was used in constructing poetry, and it suggested comprehensiveness, completeness, wholeness. It could have been David alluding to the completeness that he had found in God, as well as his complete saturation of human life and existence with the things that he calls for in the psalm: steadfast love, mercy, and compassion, which when realized call us to bless the Lord, the one who gives us all of these things. In reading this psalm, it would be hard to miss this repetition of steadfast love. It shows up many times in this psalms. That reference to the love of God shows up repeatedly and is often paired with compassion and these descriptors of God: mercy, compassion, forgiveness, healing, redemption, renewal. It makes one wonder, where is all of this coming from as David is speaking? And how can this author speak with such an authentic voice? We know that it's David who's giving voice to these characteristics of God, one who would know firsthand what it means to receive these gifts: mercy, compassion, forgiveness, healing, redemption, and renewal. Can we hear from the story of David and begin to see what ways that we might experience God more deeply? David was labeled a man after God's own heart, and he's often held up and revered as a striking example of what it means to long after God. From a young boy with the story of killing a giant who threatened his people, to being pulled from his field and his shepherding duties, to be chosen the next king of Israel. He had to outwit Saul, who saw him as a threat and threatened his life. And even though he was good friends with Saul's son and spent a lot of time in Saul's household, he was not respected by Saul, and Saul had trouble with him. And this king of Israel, as we look at his reign as the king of Israel, we look back at this exemplary time in the history of Israel. Things were going really well for them under David's rule. And there were many good reasons why he was lifted up in this way. There are many good attributes of David. His time as king saw prosperity of the nation of Israel take off and flourish. There were good times under his rule and reign. There was plenty of good reasons for him to be raised up as an example as we read his Psalms and we learn about his relationship with God. But there are other parts of his life that we are all aware of because the scripture contains them. And if we didn't examine those parts of his life, I think it'd be much harder for us to understand why he could write a psalm like 103. David had a shadow side to his life, just like all of us do. David was not perfect. He did a lot of good, and he followed God, and it was clear that he had a deep relationship with God. But again, he was not perfect. He gave in to the things of the world that caught his eye. He amassed a great wealth, and he built an impressive palace for himself and his family. And he followed the cultures of the day, and he took many wives and concubines for himself as well. And perhaps the most life-changing choice for him was calling for Bathsheba, the wife of another man, and expecting her to be for him. Now, we often overlook the power dynamics that were at play and think that Bathsheba was the willing participant in that relationship. Perhaps sometimes she's even painted as the temptress. However, we should not be too quick to overlook that she may not have had the option of saying no to the king, and most likely she didn't. For if you said no to the king, your life was often in danger. From that indiscretion comes a waterfall of events that would bring David to the bottom. A child, a murder, another death, all done in secret, out of the sight of God, only not so much. We hear from 2 Samuel, the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Spending a little time with the Hebrew word for displeased shows the depth of the actions of David and how that came against the nature of God. The word used there was yara, to be broken up, meaning God was broken up by David's actions. Further meaning is added to the depth by including in the eyes of the Lord. David, the shining example of what it meant to be a seeker of God's own heart, he spent time with the wages of sin. The prophet Nathan came to David to make him aware that the Lord had looked upon his heart and he knew. This recognition was not lost on David, that God had seen. And he spent some times in the depth of that sin and sorrow and what it brought to his house. He laid out on the ground and mourned. And there was a child that was to come from his relationship with Bathsheba, and that child would take ill and would not live. David petitioned God for his life to be saved, and he fell before God in fasting and prayer, pleading with God to be merciful. And in the end, David once again found favor in the eyes of the Lord. But it was not before there was hardship known in his house for his actions and choosings. So why does this matter as we dive into Psalm 103? Because it gives us a glimpse into the words that were offered by David in this psalm. I read Psalm 103 a little differently, knowing the story of David. These words and expressions of blessing and praise that come from the pen of David have a different meaning because they come from a place of knowing. He knows what he's writing in a way that someone who has not experienced that sin and death is not able to do. And it's not that David deserved the grace he received. According to the law of the day, then his life should have not been spared since he took the life of another. It would have been fair by the rule of that day for him to have died in this situation. Yet that is not what he received. He received grace abundantly. And who better to write of the steadfast love of the Lord than David himself? These are verses that are laden with praise and adoration, declarations about who the Lord is and how he acts towards his people. There are images that remind us of God's mercy and kindness, that the Lord works for those who are oppressed. Just as God has worked in the past, so will God work today. There are declarations of faith, of knowing. The words, the Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in love. He will not always accuse, nor will he keep his anger forever. Those words ring a little differently when we hold that with the story of David. David had spent time in that old creation where guilt and death had lived, but he also spent time in the new creation of steadfast love and grace and forgiveness and compassion and mercy. It would be easy to look at this psalm for the repetition that we hear in steadfast love. Yet there are other themes that lift out of the text that are also worth our attention. Forgiveness is something that we see rise out of the text. He does not deal with us according to our sins, nor repay us according to our iniquities. Thank heavens for that. For as the heavens are high above the earth, so great is his steadfast love towards those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far he removes our transgressions from us. There is forgiveness of sins when we call upon the Lord. While we might think that we are unforgivable, and sometimes we live in that space, God looks at us with complete justice, an act that is beyond our comprehension. We can't get it as humans. Sins forgiven and released because of who God is and the grace that God extends. We also see healing. In the day of David, it was believed that the sins of the fathers were passed along up until the 10th generation. That was a very long time for sins to be passed along, and it could cause a person to live with a fair amount of fear and concern about what might befall their household because of all of these sins that were committed in the past. But David offers a different interpretation. But the steadfast love of the Lord is from everlasting to everlasting on those who fear him, and his righteousness to his children's children. Healing that is offered keeps the passing along from happening, because we are remembered by God. Redemption is heard in these verses as well. David is able to focus on the promises that brought new life into his very broken life, to focus on the one who redeemed him from the pit, from the place of death, and to bring back the restorative power that the promise of new life has to speak hope into a situation of despair. These things come together to bring us to a place where we can seek renewal, which is at the heart of this psalm. Last week, Todd asked us how it was with our soul, inviting us to consider if we'd be willing to walk in the difficult places of life with one another. This psalm asks us to do some reflective work as well. How do we embrace the steadfast love of God and the grace and mercy that is bestowed on us, but also that's bestowed on others, even when we don't think they deserve it? Steadfast love is an important reassurance that David is working to impart in this psalm. When do we need that steadfast love? Always, yes. But also when we admit that there is pain in our own lives. If we don't have the pain from living in this broken world, then we will not need to call on the one who is noted in verses 3 and 5. Let's hear this set of questions from these verses rather than as declarations. Who forgives all your iniquity? Who heals all your diseases? Who redeems your life from the pit? Who crowns you with steadfast love and mercy? Who satisfies you with good as long as you live? Who offers saving grace, extends forgiveness, offers healing, gives redemption? It's God who gives all of these things to us, each and every one of us. There's an invitation in the Psalm of David to the people of his day and to our day as well. Come before the Lord. And there you will find steadfast love, mercy, compassion. It is there, the pain of living, that we can be placed in the presence of God. From David's own life, we see that God can take the worst that living has to offer and to transform it. Will that transformation happen right away? There are no promises there. Transformation is a process. There's not any date stamps on the psalm, so we don't know for sure when this was actually written. It may have been years later, after the events that we visited earlier. Maybe it was near the end of David's life, where it was seasoned with a little more living, a little more depth of experience. It's hard to say for sure when this came. But the invitation to us remains the same. The old offer is sin and death, and we can live there. It's possible. The new offer is life with freedom. We have that choice every day, for God promises that his mercies are new each day. And we can stay with this old, keeping our bad habits, returning to the patterns that separate us from God, or we can greet each day with the awareness that we are here by the grace of God, that each day we are offered new mercies. That steadfast love will be present even if we don't engage it. What will you choose today? The ways of the old or the offer of the new?